So good morning and welcome to Adult Education. Today is All Saints Day. We had an extra longish 8:30 service, which was beautiful, including remembering the names, and Megan delivered just a lovely sermon. When I left, we were singing I'll Fly Away, and it just about killed me to tear myself away from that song. So I imagine we'll be getting some folks trickling in from the 8:30 service. Welcome to Adult Education, and welcome to those who are joining us online. Next in our series on the good, the bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament, we have come to the book of 1 Samuel, the first of two parts. And really, Samuel was originally all one long scroll. It just happened that once they started writing these books down on a certain kind of scroll, they needed to split them up in half. But this is really going to be part one of a longer story that Matt will finish up next week. A couple of announcements as we are getting started. That is David. Yes, absolutely. We will be having a discussion group opportunity this coming Wednesday, 6:45 to 8 o'clock. Please feel free to join us following the worship service. That meets in the Meisel room and on Zoom. The Zoom link can be found in the Adult Ed e-blast. Online, we have an interview with Joel Baden. This is a friend and former professor. He was actually first my TA, then he became a professor. He was my professor, Joel Baden from Yale Divinity School, talking about 1 Samuel. We'll have another interview with him next week on 2 Samuel. I highly recommend. And then today is the last day to register for the women's retreat with Amy Margot, which is coming up on Saturday. So if you are eligible to go to this retreat, you should go to this retreat. Amy Margot is amazing. She has taught this class before, and we are delighted to have her with us. So please register today if you haven't already done so. And then finally, we are hosting, in conjunction with the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Minnesota, a lecture on Wednesday, November 15th with Professor Leora Batnitsky from Princeton. She will be talking with us about Edith Stein. Edith Stein was Jewish, converted to Catholicism, died in the Holocaust, and then was sainted by the Catholic Church. So it's a very complicated story of this iconic figure. Please join us for Professor Batnitsky's lecture on November 15th. That'll begin at 7:30 in the evening. So we won't have discussion groups that night. We'll be doing this instead. Okay, I think that's everything I've got for announcements. We're going to jump right into 1 Samuel. Here's where we are on our timeline, right? We are now firmly in the realm of history. We are talking about approximately 1,000 years before the Common Era. This is the period in which the kings Saul and Samuel and Solomon appear on the scene. We'll see here, we're going to talk a lot about the Philistines today. They're going to show up as kind of the primary enemy in these stories. And we will, by the time Matt is finished, Jerusalem will become the capital, and we'll be entering into this period of monarchy. So last class was about making that transition between the period of Joshua and Judges into the period of monarchy. And here we'll see the beginnings of that. And we'll talk a lot about what this institution of kingship means, especially for a people who are used to thinking of God as king. I will say I have taught an Old Testament survey before in my previous congregation, and this was an unexpectedly hard part. Everybody thinks the law is going to be tough and sort of gruesome and maybe kind of boring, right? Everybody pretty much knows that when we get to Joshua and Judges, we're going to have some challenging stories about conquest that we're going to have to wrestle with. And I thought Matt did such a beautiful job introducing and engaging those stories. But then we get to 1 Samuel and we know, oh, we're going to get to King David. And we breathe a sigh of relief, right? Because we know and love King David. These are going to be some good stories that'll make us feel happy. And I just want to put it out there that may not be the case today. All right, we may learn some things we don't love about King David. But before we do that, I want us to start with this table talk question. Let's say Alexandra came running into the rec room and said, I need 2 teachers to come teach a Sunday school class about King David. Right? So you get tapped. I assure you this isn't going to happen, because otherwise nobody would come to this class anymore. But let's say it did. Let's say Alexander came in here and said, I got to recruit 2 Sunday school teachers to teach a lesson on King David. What would you say? What would you teach a Sunday school class about King David? And what are some stories that you know about King David that might undermine that version? So I'll give you a couple minutes to talk amongst your tables. If you're online, we've got Scott monitoring the chat, so you're welcome to put some thoughts in the chat. What's the Sunday school version of King David, and what are some stories that undermine that version? Go ahead. Okay, I'm going to bring you guys back from planning the Sunday school class on King David. Scott, I think you've got the microphone. Would love to hear from some of the tables what you came up with. Let's start with what you came up with. What are the stories you would teach about King David? At this table over here.
So David was given the opportunity to kill Saul twice, but he did not. So showing mercy to someone who doesn't want you alive.
Right, he showed mercy to an enemy. Absolutely. Okay, we got some volunteers in the back or in the middle.
He had a big rock.
He had a big rock, or a small rock to kill a big giant. Is that the story? Yes. David and Goliath. That is a Sunday school favorite. We got some nice fuzzy felt here with, I think, a standing Goliath and then a fallen Goliath. Yeah. What else? What other stories might you tell about David? Wow, I heard a lot of talking, but I guess there's not a lot of good stories. What else might you? Okay, I see some hands over here, Scott. I see Carol and then Donna.
We decided there were two stories that stuck out first. One was David and Goliath, and the other one was David and Bathsheba, so the other side of him.
David and Bathsheba, yes. So you're going to explain that to the fifth graders. No. Yes, okay.
We were going to hold that for at least high school.
Hold that for high school, yes. No, that's good, that's good. And Donna, I see Donna up front. Oh, wait, okay. That's fine.
Oh.
David was known for making music to the Lord in
Yes.
all his psalms.
Yeah, David the musician, right? We see him playing the lyre to King Saul. tradition ascribes the Psalms to King David. We'll see it later. There's actually a psalm about what to do when you're hiding in a cave and your enemy shows up. One of the psalms is actually pegged to that particular moment in the story. Beth, I see you in the back.
Well, because for years I've been involved, along with Beverly Sinning, in the all-church book read. So I have to put a plug in for a book that we didn't choose, written by Geraldine Brooks, and it's called The Secret Chord. And it's a fictional narrative of David. And she is a renowned author who does extensive research. So it isn't just kind of a fluffy retelling. It's really good. And it's very brutally honest. Don't give it to your Sunday school kids, or I'm not even sure who. But it's a wonderfully written story about David.
Yeah,
so
that's
I would recommend that, The
wonderful.
Secret Chord.
Yeah, The Secret Chord. So that demonstrates, I mean, this is an account, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. It's a very literary account that's really lent itself to some really interesting retellings. And that word, the Secret Chord title, I don't know if that's a reference to the Leonard Cohen song, but that's another place we see this story showing up. Yeah, okay, what about the other question? What about, we've started this already with the Bathsheba story, but what stories undermine this version of David? As hero, as boy musician. Any other stories that you would withhold? Okay, well, this is going to make my job fun to get to all those stories today. Okay, so let's start by just talking about what are we going to find in 1 Samuel? What is in this book? So it begins with the birth and the call story and the ministry of the prophet Samuel. Then it's interrupted by this ark narrative. If we remember the Ark of the Covenant, we saw that especially during those chapters or those books on the law, right? It was the instructions for the construction of the ark were given in Exodus. The ark was traveling with the people to the promised land through the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy. Leviticus contained a lot of instructions about how to be a priest in the vicinity of the ark, how to behave, about the holiness of God. So the ark is going to show back up in this book. We'll get a couple of discourses on kingship, about whether starting a monarchy is a good idea or not. The prophet Samuel is going to have some opinions about that. Saul is the first king. He's going to get anointed 3 times. There'll be a lot of battles with the Philistines and some others. David gets anointed while Saul is still king, so there's going to be some trouble here. We'll see David serving in Saul's court, playing his instrument, bearing Saul's armor. Then we'll see David fleeing Saul. This combination of 2 people in the royal court at the same time, one of whom is officially the king, the other has become secretly anointed as king and holds a lot of favor in the eyes of the people, that's not a good combination. We'll see David on the run, and then we'll see the death of Saul. So a lot is going to happen in this book. And it's got certain interesting narrative features. As I've already alluded to, there are multiple subjects, right? We get Samuel and the ark, Saul, David. There's sort of 4 main characters, if we count the ark as a character in this book. There are doublings and triplings of episodes. Certain features kind of show up multiple times. There are the occasional inconsistency and abrupt transition. Something will interrupt something else that's happening. There are critiques of kingship as an institution. Even within this sort of foundational monarchy story, we get already critiques of it as an institution. The Bible contains multitudes, and one of the things it contains is sort of a critique of its own institutions. And it also contains some apologies for David. We're going to see David doing some nefarious things. We're also going to see David not doing some nefarious things, kind of refraining from things, and then those things happen anyway in a way that really benefits David. David is great at not getting his hands dirty, as we will see later on in the story. So some scholars here, we're going to look at a couple of different approaches to the David story, but then really dig in on one particular approach. So we can think of the David story theologically, right? We need to somehow establish, especially thinking of this as Christians reading the Bible, this idea of David as God's chosen, as the keeper of the covenant. And then within the Christian tradition, he's ascribed this lineage out of which Jesus arises. A shoot shall come up from the stump of Jesse, right? David has this really significant theological role. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the season of Advent, but for now, that won't be our focus for today. We could take a historical approach. If you watch our interviews with Joel, this is the approach that he'll be taking of saying, who was this guy David really, Some scholars believe that David doesn't exist, but most scholars, that David might be a sort of a mythical king, a sort of King Arthur figure. But most scholars now actually think, no, we're pretty sure David was a real guy. In part because the stories about him are so unfavorable that you wouldn't make them up, right? You wouldn't have cause to invent them. In fact, this tends to be sort of, in some cases, kind of an apology for David. So it's sort of dealing with the sort of reality of some of the less savory parts of his kingship. There's a thought that maybe some of these were different sources stitched together, which might be why you get the doublings and triplings, why you get this arc narrative that interrupts the human narrative. So that there's a historical approach to this book that can be interesting. But my primary focus today is going to be a literary focus, of sort of viewing the David story as a whole. A whole that includes multiple parts pulled together, but that's created to be kind of like a work of political biography, right? The way that you might read a biography of a president or a senator. And there's a comparison that I really like here that the scholar Robert Alter makes, where he says the David story, we can think of it kind of like one of Shakespeare's historical plays. So it's about a historical figure, but it also contains literary elements that are in there to help us understand. So we're going to get a lot of dialogue in this. We don't actually think that there was some scribe following David around writing down every word that he said, so probably some of this is some invented dialogue, but that doesn't mean we should ignore it, right? That there may be truth coming through this art for us. There's also going to be just a lot of rich literary allusions to earlier books of the Bible. We'll see allusions to Genesis and Exodus and Joshua and Judges, a real attempt to read this David story in the larger context of Israelite literature. And I want to take a pause and recommend a version of the Bible. So first of all, I want to recommend 1st and 2nd Samuel as a read, right? I didn't stand here and recommend Leviticus. Some of you actually did read Leviticus, which I'm really grateful for. But I was talking to my friend Deco about it, and he said his rabbi thinks of 1st and 2nd Samuel, of the book of Samuel, as a book that you could keep on your nightstand, right? Like, this is going to be a good read. And I want to recommend a particular version. It's going to look like a huge tome, but you don't have to get this one. So this thing, this is a translation of the Bible by Robert Alter, who is a scholar of English and of Hebrew. He's a poet. His translations are beautiful poetry, and his footnotes are incredible. I don't often recommend footnotes, but the Robert Alter translation, you can buy a box set of the entire Bible, or you can buy just the David story if you want. That'll sit on your shelf like a novel. And I would really recommend this version. It'll pull together a lot of the literary versions of the text. It wouldn't be the first Bible that I bought. That would be either the NRSV or the updated edition of the NRSV. But Robert Alter's version of the Old Testament, especially the David story, is worth the read. I'm going to put this down. I can't hold it the entire time. Okay. And here's what he says about the writer of the David story. He says, to this end, the writer feels free to invent an inner knowledge for the characters, to give their dialogue revelatory shape, to weave together episodes and characters with a fine mesh of recurrent motifs and analogies of incident, and to define the meaning of events through allusion, metaphors, and symbol. The writer does this not in order to fabricate history, but in order to understand it. I just love that way of thinking about what this is doing. I think we can get so obsessed with what's actual fact and what's fiction, what really happened and what did somebody invent. And this is kind of an invitation to enter the literary and historical world and explore what it reveals to us about themes of human nature, of power, of family relationships. And there's a ton of that in these stories that we have. So as I shared, we'll start with the birth of Samuel. We'll hit the ark narrative. That's the ark up there with some guys carrying it. We'll see the rise of Saul as a king, and then the rise of David and the fall of Saul. So let's start with Samuel. Who can tell me the story of Samuel's birth? Does anybody know that story, who his mom was? Yes, I see up here. Scott, would you mind running the mic again? Right over here, if we still have it. Okay, and Rocky over in this corner over here.
So Hannah was barren, and she, I think there was another woman involved who also had a child with her husband, but at any rate, she promised God her firstborn if she were to become pregnant. Mm-hmm. And she did become pregnant with Samuel, and he was given to the temple after he was weaned. And I think it was Eli.
Yeah.
Eli was the priest at the temple, and one night Samuel came to the priest in the middle of the night because he'd heard a voice saying, Samuel, Samuel. And he goes to the priest 3 times. I'll cut to the chase. Eli finally figures out it wasn't him, it must be God. And so he said, you're supposed to say, Samuel, next time you hear the voice, speak, Lord, thy servant heareth. And he did that, and he was told that he was going to be a great prophet.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. That was very good. Spoken like somebody who's maybe taught some Sunday school? Oh, lovely. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. Yes, absolutely. So we begin not with the story of David, but with the story of Samuel, with this prophet, and we get his birth story. We actually don't get a birth story for David, which is going to be interesting. We get a birth story for the prophet. It begins by saying, there was a certain man from Ramathaim named Elkanah, son of. But as you say, it immediately shifts to being about Hannah, his mother. This is a story about a woman. It's about a woman who experiences some rivalry, some jealousy, and the other woman in the story is Elkanah's other wife. And so there's also a theme of infertility. Hannah is having trouble conceiving, although she is the favored wife. She is the one who's having trouble conceiving. This takes us back. Who do we remember having this same dynamic earlier in our class? Sarah, yep, Sarah and Hagar. Who else? Leah and Rachel, right? So we're getting these motifs, these allusions to earlier texts. We are clearly within the sort of family dynamics of the story of Israel. And then Hannah prays to the Lord at the temple at Shiloh. We're not in Jerusalem yet. The temple is in Shiloh. And we get a sort of parody of an Annunciation story, right? Because in our previous stories, an angel had appeared to, for example, in the tent of Abraham and Sarah to tell them, you will conceive and bear a son. And here, instead of an angel appearing, the priest Eli thinks that Hannah is drunk. Because she's praying so loudly, right? Her complaint is rising to the Lord in such a way. So Eli tries to kick her out, then realizes what she's doing, and then does hear her. Eli is a kind of tragic figure. His sons are very corrupt. Let's see. His sons are corrupt. They have a 3-pronged fork. Does anybody know what the fork is for? For the devil? No, it's not for the devil. The fork is for, that was Halloween. The fork is for when people come into the temple to make sacrifices. Remember all those burnt offerings and sacrifices that were described earlier? So the sons of Eli, they take the long fork and they get some of the meat out during the sacrifice and eat it. Right? So they are sort of taking off the top from the sacrifices that are coming to the house of the Lord. There's also some sexual impropriety. I mean, Eli's setup here is not good. You can leave that out of the Sunday school version. Maybe talk about the fork, but not the sexual impropriety. And so that's what we're sort of facing. That's the sort of condition of things in Israel at the time. So we're told that the Lord remembers Hannah. And that theme of the Lord remembering, the Lord remembered the Israelites in Egypt. The Lord remembers people in their suffering. So we get that verb again. And the Lord hears her prayer. Hannah conceives and bears a son. She keeps Samuel with her until she's weaned. She has another opportunity to go up to the temple. She says, no, I'm going to stay here with him until he's weaned. There's this real sort of maternal tenderness that she's promised Samuel to the Lord, but she's going to keep him with her for as long as she can. And then when she's weaned, she takes him to the temple and gives him over into the Lord's service. And then there's this beautiful little detail, which Samuel wears an ephod, which is a priestly garment, but She makes him a different cloak every year. She comes and she brings him a new cloak. There's a tenderness to this, and we'll actually see the cloak showing up later in the story and being an important garment. So Hannah's involvement begins here, and it doesn't end here because that cloak will bear significance later on in the story. And then Hannah sings this song of great reversal. This is Hannah's song, which will call to mind the Magnificat. There are themes of the mighty being brought low, the barren bearing 7, the Lord sort of bringing down and raising up, a reversal of fortunes between rich and poor. And this sort of reversal of fortunes, here Hannah's also foreshadowing another of the themes of the book, where Saul will initially have a rise, but then he'll fall while David rises. So she's really kind of setting up and framing this entire book. Then we get the call of Samuel, which you have also described for us. The word of the Lord was rare in those days, partly because of Eli's sons being corrupt. But even still, Eli can recognize that this is God's call. God speaks to Samuel and says, I am about to do something that will make the ears of anyone who hears it tingle. And I love the color of this. And then gives Samuel this prophecy. And the prophecy, the first thing that Samuel has to say is a really hard thing to say, which is he has to tell his boss Eli that he and his sons will fall, that Eli's house is corrupt, and that his sons will die and lose power. And so Samuel's first job is a hard prophetic job. He has to say something to the boss that the boss doesn't want to hear, but Eli, to his credit, hears him, doesn't kick him out of the temple, and Samuel grows in service to the Lord, and all of Israel knows that Samuel is this prophet. And his role combines a number of aspects of the prophetic role. So he begins with this sort of priestly location in the temple at Shiloh. He takes on a prophetic role. His first words are prophetic words. He serves as a judge. Later we're told that he's sort of filling this circuit judge role, not over all of Israel, but over a particular region. He's a military leader who will lead Israel to victory with the help of God. So Samuel we can kind of think of as one of the early prophets, but we can also think of him as the last of the judges, these people who played a military and judicial role in Israel. So he's kind of this transitional figure at the threshold. And then we're going to switch gears pretty abruptly here to the ark narrative. So suddenly, Samuel kind of disappears from the scene, and the ark comes in. In those days, the Philistines mustered for a war against Israel, and Israel went out to battle against them. So one of the things we need to do here is kind of set the geopolitical scene for who the Philistines are and what they're up to, because they're going to play an important role in this narrative. And we'll see that this will be, the setting is very much the same. We're talking about the setting of the coastal plains of this land. So they are part of the migration of sea peoples out of the Aegean and around the Mediterranean. They were rebuffed from entering Egypt, but settled on the coastal plains southwest of Israel around the 12th century BCE. So this really is where contemporary Gaza is today. They had a coalition of 5 cities, one of which was Gaza, Ascalon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These are the 5 cities of the Philistines. And they're characterized by an organized military. They have chariots. They have a strong economic base from all the trading that they're doing, and they also can make iron weapons. And we're told that at a certain point they have a monopoly on the sharpening of iron. Israel comes to depend on the Philistines for their weapons. They do appear in some of the earlier books of the Bible. They've been around for a while, but at this point their strength has built, and they've become an enemy within the region that Israel is dealing with, which is part of the impetus to call for a king at this point. They showed up. Samson in the book of Judges was fighting the Philistines. Somebody noticed. Where's Barbara? Is Barbara here today? No, Barbara Guth. She noticed in our maps, she was looking at the maps very carefully and noticed there were 2 locations for the tribe of Dan in one of the maps. And she asked me and Matt if that was a mistake. And we actually didn't know. So we looked it up. And it turns out that the tribe of Dan does show up in 2 places due to some relocation because of a battle with the Philistines. And at some point, it looks like the Judahites were even vassals to the Philistines. So They're around throughout the Bible, but in this period it becomes kind of a crisis. So here's where they're located, on the coastal plain. Okay, so the Israelites are experiencing a crisis. They don't yet have a king. They say to themselves, "Why has the Lord put us to rout before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, so that he may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." And the problem with what's happening here is that the people are using the ark as a totem, right? As an object that contains some power or some force that they think will help them. They think that if they maneuver the ark and take it into battle against the Philistines, that they will then emerge victorious. But if we remember the movement of the ark from the Exodus narrative, from the book of Numbers, it was always God who was in charge of where the ark went. The Lord would ascend like a cloud from the tent, and the people would follow it. And here we see kind of the opposite happening. Here what we see is a desire to manipulate the presence of God by moving the ark around. And it goes terribly wrong. There is a crisis. The ark is captured. And then Eli hears the news of this and dies. He hears the news first that his sons are dead. That doesn't faze him. But when he hears that the ark is dead, he falls over. When he hears that the ark is captured, he falls over. This is terrible news that this holy presence has left Israel. And if we think of the context of when these books are being finalized and edited and written down, that comes during a period of exile after the temple in Jerusalem, the first temple in Jerusalem, has been destroyed, and the presence of God and the holy objects in the temple have been carried off. So this is a national crisis that ensues. Eli dies. Eli's daughter-in-law, newly widowed, gives birth to a son and names the son Ichabod, which means the glory, which is kavod, is exiled from Israel. God's glory has left. The ark has left. This is a national crisis and tragedy. So the ark is taken to Ashdod, and when it's taken there and resides there, the ark, even though it can't be manipulated by human beings, still has these incredible powers. So the Philistine god falls to the ground when the ark is left overnight in the Philistines' temple in Ashdod. And then, let's see, the hand of the Lord is heavy against the Philistines. We see that word kavod. The hand of the Lord is heavy against the Philistines. There are plagues. When did we last see plagues? In Egypt, in the Exodus narrative. So again, this sort of calling back to an earlier point in the story. The Philistines are afraid. They take the ark to the city of Gath. And then they say, forget this ark. This is terrible for us. Let's send it back. So they send it back, and they send it back with this beautiful offering of 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice. I guess these are objects that are meant to represent the plague that has befallen them. So they make golden versions of them, one to represent each of the cities, and send this back. And they have 2 milch cows pull a cart. The cows have never worn the yoke. They have young calves who have not yet been weaned, and yet, miraculously, with no experience of the yoke, with no humans to drive them, they go away from the direction of their calves, and they bring the ark up the hill to the Israelites, where it comes to rest. And it's dangerous when it gets there. The Israelites look inside the ark and then die. Because the ark is this powerful object. It is not for us to manipulate or take lightly. And it comes to rest at Kiriath Jearim. One detail to note about this ark narrative, those milking cows, as they go uphill pulling the ark, they are lowing. And one of the details that Robert Alter notes about this is they are leaving calves who are not yet weaned. And he calls back again to the Hannah story, right? And says, here again we have this story of this maternal love, this offering. So even though there's this intrusion of this narrative that looks really different from the rest of the story, this ark narrative doesn't have a lot of human characters. It's primarily this sort of almost magical act, this miraculous act of God. there's still these elements that whoever has woven them together has pulled together to make a unified story of all of this. So after the ark is back, we return to the prophet Samuel. We hear about him judging Israel. We hear about military victories that happen. He almost tries to make a kingship of things, at least make a dynasty. He anoints his sons to be prophet to succeed him, but they, like the sons of Eli, are corrupt. Even though Samuel is seen as this kind of heroic figure in the story, he's not perfect. And when he tries to sort of continue to empower his own dynasty, his sons fail to live up to his own leadership. So then the Israelites ask him for a king. And at this point, Samuel prays to God about this because he's kind of miffed that the Israelites are asking for a king. Because he's this prophet, he's just led them to victory. He can hear their confessions. He can perform religious rituals for them. He can lead them for military victory. Why would they want someone else? And God says, listen to the voice of the people in all that they have said to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So here's this view that kingship is a displacement of God as king. But nevertheless, God says, go ahead and pick a king for the Israelites, and we'll go ahead and work with that, right? So if you remember from last time, Matt setting up this idea of this part of the story, when we're getting into the story, the prophets section, the historical writing section, is really about how does this vision that was outlined in the Torah actually work on the ground? Well, here it is. Kingship is one of those institutions, not a perfect institution. Samuel gives a warning about kingship. It reminds me of some of those speeches like Washington's last speech at the end of his presidency or Eisenhower's speech, the military-industrial complex, right? A speech of warning about a certain kind of exercise of power. Where he says, this will be the manner of the king that will raise over you. And that word manner in Hebrew is mishpat, which could mean either practice, like a manner or a style. It could also mean justice, right? So this is the justice of the king. It's a pun that's kind of a perversion, because as you can see, the operative verb here is take. The king will take your sons, he will take your daughters, he'll take your fields, your vineyards, your olive yards, he'll take your seed, he'll take your manservants and maidservants, he'll take all of this stuff, and you will be his servants. It's this warning that the power of the king will be a taking power. And then you shall cry out, but the Lord will not hear you. Again, echoes of Exodus, right? The Israelites cried out, and the Lord remembered, and the Lord heard. And what we're getting here is a warning that because they've chosen otherwise, the Lord will not hear them. So it's a pretty dire warning that we get. But then we shift gears, and we get to Saul, who is chosen as the first king. And sometimes Saul in this narrative is portrayed as a buffoon, and in other times he's portrayed as kind of a good-looking guy. You know, there's this. We get another of these formulas that introduces a new story is about to start. There's a man of Benjamin. His name was Kish. He was the son of a Benjaminite. So we've got a story that locates in place and in genealogy, gives a name. And it said, there's not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. He stood head and shoulders taller than everybody else. So Saul's got kind of the look of a king. And then the thing is, though, that Saul's first action, the first thing we see him doing, is looking for his father's donkeys. His father's donkeys have gotten lost. So we don't see Saul riding into battle. We see him looking for a bunch of asses. And then his first words, right, are, let us turn back, or my father will stop worrying about the donkeys and start worrying about us. So his first words are words of indecision and uncertainty. He's going to leave a job unfinished because he's worried about his dad, worried about him. And the first words of any given character in this story are really important. So the first words that Saul says here are kind of foreshadowing of some of his characteristics. And one thing we should always be looking at when we look at Saul is an imbalance of information. Saul uniquely seems to have no idea what's going on. And we'll see this happen again and again. So Samuel anoints Saul. At first, there's this sort of private anointing that they have. Saul gets Saul's servant suggests that they go see this seer who maybe has some power, just not to be anointed as king, just to tell him where the donkeys are, right? Saul's still fixated on the donkey problem. Meanwhile, the Lord has given Samuel all this information that this guy named Saul from the tribe of Benjamin is going to show up. He's my choice for king. Go ahead and anoint him. So Saul shows up thinking he's looking for information about the location of the donkeys. Samuel says, here's a nice feast. Please sit at the head of the table. Why don't you sleep up on the roof tonight with the lovely fresh air? And then in the morning, Samuel sends everyone away and anoints Saul as king. So the first time that Samuel anoints Saul, remember there's 3 of them, happens in private. Nobody else is around to witness, but Samuel anoints Saul as king. The second anointing comes when Samuel gathers it comes a couple chapters later, or at the end of this chapter, when Samuel gathers the people together at Mizpah, which is the site of one of Samuel's victories against the Philistines, to anoint Saul as king. And Samuel doesn't mention that he's previously anointed this guy Saul, or that God has pointed him out. Instead, he chooses by lot from among the tribes. Benjamin wins the lottery, and then from among the people of Benjamin, there's another lottery, and Saul is chosen and anointed. And then after this, Saul goes home. He doesn't set up a capital. He doesn't set up institutions of kingship. He doesn't start to tax people. He goes back to farming, right? Saul doesn't have these sort of ambitions of grandeur. He's a farmer who's gotten sort of himself caught up in this. And then there's another external threat. So that was the anointing by lot. And then there's an external threat to Israel, and this time the people do go to Saul seeking aid. And so what Saul does is conscript an army to defeat the Ammonites. These are not the Philistines. This is a different group. We remember Moab and Ammon from what Matt was saying earlier. These are the descendants of the daughters of Lot. They are also enemies kind of on the other side. So in order to conscript everybody, Samuel sends around the cut-up pieces of an ox. And he sends pieces of ox around to all the tribes, and he says, I'll do this to your oxen if you don't enlist. And so the people enlist. And they have a military victory. And after the victory, they said, yep, let's anoint this guy as king. So this time, by the people's acclamation, Saul is anointed as king. Samuel gives another warning at this point. He says, whose ox have I taken? Whose ass have I taken, right? You haven't seen me taking your stuff, but now you've got this king who's going to be taking your stuff. The Lord has rescued you. The Lord has sent judges to lead you, and yet you have chosen a king. So then we get the story of Saul's downfall. There's a couple of reasons given for this. One is that he makes a sacrifice to the Lord before going into battle. Now, Samuel was supposed to show up and offer the sacrifice, but Samuel is delayed. Saul doesn't know where Samuel is, and then makes the sacrifice on Samuel's behalf. This is considered a faux pas. The second thing that Saul does, and to us this feels incomprehensible, but Saul has received instructions from the Lord via Samuel to put the Amalekites to the ban, which is that kind of total destruction that Matt was talking about in the book of Judges. Kill everything. And he doesn't do it. He spares the king, he spares the animals, keeping them as booty, and that gets him in trouble too. Saul comes to him and says, you have failed to obey the Lord in this. I will not return with you, for you've rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you. And so what we see here is actually Samuel beheading the Amalekite king. This lovely stained glass image is Samuel doing it on Saul's behalf. And at this point, Saul catches Samuel's robe. Remember the importance of that cloak that Samuel has. Saul catches it and tears it. He's so upset. He wants Samuel to stay with him. He doesn't want Samuel to leave him. And Samuel uses that as kind of a sign act, a symbolic gesture. And he says, just as you have torn my robe, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this very day. So this is the beginning of the end for Saul. So then we get a couple of introductions of David. We have Samuel visiting Jesse in Bethlehem. Just Jesse, some guy, some Bethlehemite. No birth story, no fancy call story here. And chooses David from among the brothers and anoints him as king. Another kind of secret anointing that's not public. At this point, a public anointing would be very dangerous for David, because even though we're told that the Lord's spirit has departed from Saul and the Lord's spirit has come to rest on David, Saul is very much institutionally king. And so it would be dangerous for David to rival him in this way. Instead, David becomes Saul's lyre player and armor bearer. This is the musician David, who is in the court of Saul. And we are told David is young, he is ruddy, he is handsome. Everybody loves David. He is this charmer of a guy. And I feel like that may have actually carried forward and be part of why we love David in spite of this like troubling legacy, right? He's got this charisma and is adored. And so that's one of the introductions that brings him right into the court of Saul, using his musical skill to calm Saul's ever-increasing fits of jealousy and sort of madness. Saul is portrayed as going mad at this point. Very Shakespearean. Another version of the story appears where David's brothers are fighting with Saul against the Philistines. A champion emerges, Goliath, who says, "Who from Israel will fight me?" And David raises his hand to fight Goliath. Goliath is there looking nice and green. And weirdly, Saul doesn't seem to remember who David is. He needs to be reintroduced to this young champion. But that's this sort of second version of David's introduction onto the scene. And see his first words. Remember, first words are important. The first things that David says are what is to be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel. So he basically says, what's in it for me? Right? He's overheard some soldiers saying that the king will greatly enrich the man who kills Goliath and give him his daughter and make his family live tax-free in Israel, right? Like this is this great promise of benefits. And David wants to make sure. So his first words are, what will be done for the man who kills Goliath? And then he says something pious. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So always with David, there's this combination of self-interest and piety. The one place where David is never maligned is his devotion to God, right? That piece is always clear. No matter how morally dubious what he's doing is, his faithfulness is really held up by the story. The relationship between David and Saul goes sour. Jonathan loves David. David is victorious in a lot of battles. He's enjoying military success. People start singing, Saul has killed his thousands, David his 10,000s. So the people's song reflects this growing popularity for David, which is dangerous to Saul. Saul gets jealous twice, tries to run David through with the spear. Israel and Judah, we are told, love David. Curiously, we're never told that David loves anyone else. We don't get the verb David loving somebody else. It's always somebody else loves David. That was one of the nice noticings from Alter there. Saul offers Michal. Michal is Saul's daughter, and says, the price for her is merely 100 Philistine foreskins. Just bring those to me, and you can have my daughter, which is, obviously no easy task. Saul thinks David's going to be killed. David brings him double. Michal loves David. She helps him escape. Jonathan and Michal both repeatedly intervene on David's behalf as things get more and more dangerous. She lets him down the window when her father's servants are coming in to kill David. She makes a fake David in the bed, under the covers of the bed, out of the household gods. This sounds like something out of like a kid's movie, but she makes a fake David to throw off the pursuers. And that's also an allusion to Rachel, who saves her husband Jacob in a similar way. So then David seeks shelter. He goes to Nob, where a priest gives him consecrated bread and the sword of Goliath. He goes to Gath, a Philistine city where the king recognizes him, and so David has to pretend to be mad. He goes to the cave of Adullam, and a band gathers around David, this band of 400 guys. And the people who come to gather around him are everyone who is in distress, everyone who is in debt, and everyone discontented. This is not the sort of cream of the crop, right? Like, these are the people who are not really making it in the rest of Israelite society. And so this is this sort of desperate band that gathers around David and flees with him all of these places. He goes to Moab, where he hides his parents. Remember, David's great-great-great-great-great-grandmother is Ruth, a Moabite. So he goes to that land and gives his parents shelter there. And then a prophet tells him, come back into Judah, be back in Judah now. I am running out of time, which is why I am racing through this. It's too bad. Saul finds out, and he orders this guy Doug the Edomite to kill the priests of Nob, the priest who had given David refuge and shelter. Saul gets so angry that they had done that he orders them killed. None of the Israelites will obey his orders to kill a priest, right? Saul is getting increasingly unhinged, giving these orders to kill Israelite priests. And so Doeg the Edomite, who is, I guess, an Edomite mercenary working for Saul, carries out the order. So we're seeing again and again this sort of devolving, unhinged Saul. David comes back to Judah. He rescues a town. He learns that Saul is coming for him. He hides in a cave. Saul goes into that same cave in order to go to the bathroom. Maybe this would be good for Sunday school. That's a good detail. Saul comes in to relieve himself in the cave. David's hiding in the back of the cave, and his men say, "This is your chance. The Lord just delivered him into your hands. Kill Saul." David can't kill Saul, right? If he kills the seated king, he is delegitimized as a king. So if bad things happen for Saul, that's good for David. He's not going to celebrate. He never celebrates when anything bad happens to Saul. But David can't be the agent of Saul's destruction, and he's smart enough to know that. And so instead, he takes his knife and he just cuts off a corner of Saul's cloak while Saul is going to the bathroom, and then comes out of the cave, obeys Saul, says, my Lord, my king, and then shows the piece of the cloak to Saul to say, "I spared your life. I had the opportunity to take your life. I spared it. Why would I hurt you? I have no desire to hurt you." And again, we have that cloak, right? That same image throughout that David is using here to sort of both violate the king, because the cloak is an important part of the king's authority, but also to spare the king's life and preserve his own reputation. This is where Psalm 57, if you're looking for a psalm to pray when your enemy has come into the same cave as you, Psalm 57 is that psalm. Let's see. Oh, I wish I could tell this story. This story is a doozy of a story. I'm gonna skip by it. David spares Saul's life again in the field. Let's just say Nabal and Abigail racketeering. David sets up a protection racket, ends up killing the person that he's presumably protecting, and then he ends up with that person's wife. So again, not a story that looks great for David. He spares Saul's life again, this time in